Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second in the series of the Shiurim on Chametz. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick synopsis of the main points of last week's Shiur. That the first time Chametz occurred in history was in Gan Eden, with the Etz Hadat. We said that the Etz Hadat, according to one of the Shitot, was a chita, was wheat, and that Chava, as part of the Chet Etz Hadat, she turned the wheat into a bread, a chametz bread, and that is the main guf of the Chet. It was preceded by giving Adam wine to drink to encourage him to do pru uruvu, and it ended up with Adam himself eating the chametz bread, and the result of that is Adam, who is called the Chala of the Olam, Chalato shel Olam, he was diminished in stature. The first stage of the tikkun for the Chet Etz Hadat, as we spoke about last week, was the Avot, the three Avot, each one, the Avot and the Imahot, of course, each one in turn did their own part of the tikkun, like Abraham and Sarah when they baked matzot for Pesach, etc., etc. This week we're going to be talking about a different aspect of Chametz. We're going to talk about the inyan of Chametz in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. Before we actually get into the sefer and start talking about the the continuation of last week's theme, I just want to give a short introduction, which is not exactly Jewish related, but it's more history related in terms of Egypt and Chametz. So first of all, we know that Mitzrayim was descended from Cham. Cham was the great-great-great-grandfather of Mitzrayim, great-grandfather of Mitzrayim, I think. And they say, the Chazal say that Mitzrayim was a Gilgul of Cain. It was descended from the side of Adam from Cain and not from heaven. Egypt, already from a very early stage, became well known as a main superpower for food, for grains. The reason Egypt was predominant in that area, historians say, well, not only historians, also archaeologists say, is because the climate in Egypt is perfectly suited for storing and growing grains. The Nile Basin is a very fertile area. The Nile overflows. It's very fertile land to grow crops. But the problem with a moist climate is that after you've harvested the wheat, if you don't have a dry climate to store the wheat can go moldy. You cannot store it for a very long time. So Egypt is blessed in the sense they've got both a very humid climate around the Nile. They also have the desert, which is a very dry climate. So they have a perfect climate for growing and storing wheat. So Egypt very soon in history became established as the grain basket of the world. Already before Am Yisrael went down to Egypt, the Yaakov and the 12 Shvatim, we know that Abraham, when Abraham, he has a page. When Abraham came to Eretz Canaan, after Hashem said to him, Lech Lecha, there was a famine in Eretz Canaan. The first place Abraham naturally went to find food was Mitzrayim, because Mitzrayim was blessed with natural resources, including wheat. When you have a lot of wheat, you have a lot of bread, right? And when you have a lot of bread, you have a lot of bakers. You have a lot of knowledge about growing wheat and processing wheat and making bread out of wheat, making beer. They were very well known for making beer. The Egyptians were the first nation in the world to invent making beer, fermenting grains to make alcoholic brew. So Mitzrayim very soon became well known for its baking skills as well. According to the archaeologists, the first time that fermented bread was found in archaeological remains was in Egypt. It may have been that it predated Egypt, but they haven't found any archaeological evidence of that. The first archaeological evidence of bread that has fermented, had become chametz, was in Egypt. There's a whole diyun in the history books how yeast was discovered They say that it was discovered in ancient Egypt by an Egyptian housewife who was preparing her dough for making her bread every day, and she forgot her dough, and it remained in the kitchen for the remainder of the day, and it started to rise up. And then she discovered that the bread had risen, the dough had risen, so she thought it had gone bad. She smelt it smelt a little bit sour, so she was just about to toss it in the garbage when she had a brainwave. She said, instead of throwing the bread away, I'm going to bake it into bread anyway. Maybe my husband won't even notice. So she baked this bread, and what did she get? Instead of getting her regular bread, which is a kind of a flat matzah kind of bread, like a lafa, flat bread, she got a bread which is very similar to a pita. It had risen up, it had volume, it was full of air. She gave it to her husband, who obviously fell in love with this new high-tech bread, and she never went back to baking with it. That's according to the Wikipedia talking about the discovery of yeast. But the historians, they say that that was not really accurate, because the Egyptians were expert beer brewers, and they knew how to brew beer. They knew that yeast fermented the brew of the beer, and it was more likely that the use of the fermentation froth from the beer in the bread was not by accident, but rather by design. It was more likely as a process of experimentation and rather than accident. Either way, Egypt was very well known for its baking skill and its baking knowledge. The first time in history we find loaves of breads in different kinds of shapes, not just flat matzah bread, lafa bread, pita bread. We find all different kinds of shapes of bread. The Egyptians used to bake bread in something called a bedja, B-E-D-J-A, bedja pots. It's like a ceramic kind of pot, which they used to take the lid, and they used to heat the lid first over the fire to make it very hot. Then they would put the dough in this ceramic pot and cover the top of the pot with a lid which had been heated, and put the pot on top of a fire, so it was getting the heat both from above and from below, very much like a brick oven. And they used to bake big fat loaves of bread in ceramic pots. The Egyptian culture was a culture of avodah zarah, and many of the breads used in Egypt were for the purpose of their avodah zarah. They were very, many of them were very sexual in nature, because the Egyptians had a culture of fertility, and many of their breads used in their rituals reflected this theme. So the Egyptians were experts in baking bread that had risen up and was not a flat bread. As opposed to Am Yisrael, who came down to Egypt, they had a culture of baking matzot from Avraham Avinu through Yitzchak and through Yaakov. Their culture was not to bake risen breads, highly risen breads, but rather flat breads like matzot. Chazal, the Torah tells us, not only Chazal, the Torah tells us that the two cultures of bread, the Egyptians and Am Yisrael, clashed. They were not allowed to share bread with each other. The Egyptians considered the Israelite bread an abomination, and it was vice versa, the same thing. The Am Yisrael were not allowed to eat bread with the Mitzrim. Maybe that was the origins of pat akum, that you're not allowed to eat bread baked by a goy. So that is an introduction just from a historical, archaeological perspective. Let's get back to our theme that we started last week about the tikkun for the chet etz hadat, the second stage. Hashlav hasheni, look at source number 17. השלב השני לתיקון חטא עץ הדעת היה בירידת בני ישראל למצרים, ארץ החמץ. Egypt was known as Eretz HaChametz. It was publicized for this technology that they had developed. It raised them above other nations. It gave them an edge over other nations in terms of their technology. It was called Eretz HaChametz, and there's hints in the Psukim. If you take the word Ochel Machmetzet in Gematria, gives you the gematria is Paro, Balak, and Bilam. The Eitz Oseh Pri, which we talked about last week, which was the Eitz Hadat in gematria, is Paro Melech Mitzrayim. So the part of the tikkun for the Chet Eitz Hadat was Am Yisrael going down to Egypt. It was an essential part of the tikkun that Am Yisrael had to undergo in order to mechaper for Adam and Chava. If you remember in Parshat Vayera, I think, when Hashem tells Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom. So Abraham hears this and he hears that Sodom is going to be destroyed. Abraham immediately enters into a negotiation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ulai matzun sham 50 tzadikim, 45 tzadikim, 40, 30. He goes into a whole negotiation trying to save Sodom. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Abraham, Ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, that Am Yisrael is eventually going to go down to Egypt ל-400 shana. What does Abraham do? Does he start negotiating? Ulai 300 shana, ulai 350 shana. No negotiation. Hashem's said to him, 400 years you have to be in Mitzrayim. It's non-negotiable. As opposed to Sodom, where Abraham entered into a deal. And why did Abraham not try to reduce the sentence of Am Yisrael in Egypt? And the reason for that is because it had to be a kapara for the Eitz Hadat. To lechaper al Eitz Hadat, there's a tahalich that you have to go through, and it's a fixed tahalich. You can't change the length of the tahalich, and therefore Abraham did not negotiate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Let's. Everything is a tikkun for Eitz Hadat, nachon. Even today it's a tikkun for the Eitz Hadat. So after Adam was expelled from Gan Eden, Hashem situated 2 angels at the entrance to Gan Eden to prevent access to the Eitz Chaim. The Eitz Chaim, as we described in last week's Shiur, is equivalent to the Torah. Eitz Chaim is the Torah, and Hashem put a fence around the Torah. When Adam was expelled from Gan Eden, he put 2 angels there, Lahat HaCherev HaMitapechet, to prevent Adam from accessing the Torah. La'achar she'itil ha'nachash zohamato b'chava, we said that one of the elements of the Chet Eitz Hadat was Gilui Arayot with the Nachash and Chava, from which out came Cain, was born from that union. Nesar ha'adam ba'achila me'etz ha'chayim ad shetusar klipat ha'nachash. So from the time that Adam was expelled from Gan Eden, he was not allowed access to the Eitz HaChaim until the tikkun was done for the sin with the Nachash. Lachen hitnasa Yosef be'eshet Potifar. One of the elements of tikkun for the Gilui Arayot was the nisayon of Yosef with Eshet Potifar, and that was an element of tikkun for the Gilui Arayot with Chava. According to Chazal, some opinions say that Cain was from the Zera of the Nachash. Hikdim Yehuda, the next page just before source number 18, Hikdim Yehuda b'yordam Mitzrayma, it says, Ve'et Yehuda shalach lefanav el Yosef leorot lefanav Goshna, vayavohu alza Goshen. Before Yaakov and his family went down to Egypt, he first sent Yehuda ahead. Why did he send Yehuda to Eretz Goshen ahead of them? To establish yeshivot, that they could do Talmud Torah. Goshna in Gematria is Nachash. So again, we have an element here of kapara for the sin of the Nachash. V'hu tikuno. Source number 18. Ba'u b'nei Yisrael Mitzrayma. Mitzrayim had a nickname. It was called Ervat Haaretz. How do we know this? Because when Yosef was in Mitzrayim and his brothers came down to get grains, Yosef had them arrested, and he sort of accused them of being spies. What did he say in the pasuk? Ki ervat haaretz batem lirot. That's what Yosef accused them of, that you came to check out Egypt. How did he describe Egypt? Ervat haaretz. Chazal say that all different parts of the world are connected with different parts of the human body. For example, Tabur haaretz, the belly button of the world, is Eretz Israel. It's right in the center of the world. There's all different associations with different parts of the world and different parts of the human body. And Mitzrayim is called Ervat Haaretz. Meaning the erva. Everybody knows what erva is. להתנסות באריות ולצאת נקיים. So the reason that they had to go down to Eretz Mitzrayim is because part of the sin of the Etz Hadat was Gilui Arayot. So the tikkun for that is that Am Yisrael had to undergo a test of Arayot and come out clean. They had to pass the test and come out clean, and that was the tikkun for the Gilui Arayot element of the Etz Hadat. כפי שהוכח במי הסוטה, המרים במרה. When Am Yisrael went out of Egypt, one of the places they came to in the first part of their journey was Mara. Mara was a place where they found a source of water that they couldn't drink from. Why couldn't they drink from it? Because it was bitter. So the Zohar HaKadosh says that the reason that they had to go through Mara is because the Nisayon of Mara was like a Korban Sotah. Just like in a Korban Sotah, the woman who is suspected of adultery has to drink bitter water. So Am Yisrael had to undergo the test of a sotah. Why did they have to do this? Because when they left Egypt, the Egyptians were mocking Am Yisrael. They said, for 210 years, you were slaves in Egypt, and you were working out in the Pitom and Ramses doing all the building and the banking the bricks, etc. And meanwhile, your wives were servants in our home. And how do you know what happened with your wives while you were out at work, right? How do you know that your children are really your children? They may be our children. They were mocking Am Yisrael. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says we have to silence them, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu subjected Am Yisrael to the Korban Sotah at Mara, and everyone came out clean except for one person. It says it in the Chumash B'ofen Meforash. It says Shlomit bat Divri lematei Dan. There was one woman who was the wife of Datan, I think Datan and Aviram. Datan's wife, Datan was a shoter. He was one of the shotrim in Eretz Mitzrayim. And one day when he went out to work, one of the Egyptian guards came into his house and raped Datan's wife, Shlomit. And the Pasuk says, why was she called Shlomit bat Divri? What does it mean, bat Divri? That wasn't her real name. But Divri means that she was very talkative. It means that she would see any person she would see, she would engage in conversation with them. And that is why she got to the stage that the Mitzri actually noticed her in the first place. If she was inside, she wasn't visible, he wouldn't have noticed her.
Her son is supposed to be the Mekalel.
The Mekalel was her son, exactly. Okay, so we said in Mara there was a Korban Sotah. Minchat Sotah, kamo ha'omer, the mincha of the Sotah is the same ingredients as the Minchat ha'omer. When they bring the Korban ha'omer on Pesach, it is exactly the same ingredients as one isaron of solet made from seorah, from barley. And we said that in last week's shir we spoke about that Chava used the chita from the Etz Hadat. She used gimel se'ah to make a chametz bread. So this was kapara for the element of making the bread. Kelechem she'afta Chava. V'chen sotah b'gematria belechem. רק אישה אחת זנתה עם מצרי והתורה הודיעה את שמה, שלומית בת עברי למטה דן, שחזרה על חטא חווה. חווה פטפטה עם הנחש. Chava entered into a conversation with the Nachash, which she should not have done. כך שלומית פטפטה בדברים, רש"י says שלום עלייך, שלום עליך וכו' וכו', ולכן בנה המקלל, therefore the son of Shlomit was the מקלל, שנולד מזוהמת המצרי, the מקלל was born from the father who was a מצרי, לעג למנחת לחם הפנים, כפי שקין, שנולד לחווה מזוהמת הנחש, לעג למנחתו באביאו, מהירוד שבתבואה, ומשבט דן היה, שסימנו נחש. So we see again another connection here with the Nachash and the Chet Etz Hadat. They say that all 210 years in Egypt, Am Yisrael were not slaves for 210 years. They were only slaves for the final 86 years. The Shiabud only began in the final 86 years. The hard labor began only in the last 86 years after Yosef died. HaShiabud echel achar mot Yosef, and we get a remez from the word Seor. Seor in Gematria is Vayamot Yosef v'kol echav v'chol hador hahu. במצרים תקנו בני ישראל את נשמות אדם וחווה כאשר פרו וישרצו וירבו ויעצמו במאוד מאוד. So that is the description of Am Yisrael in slavery in Egypt. Paru, vayishretzu, vayirbu, v'chulei. Why does this whole description come? What does it teach us? So, first of all, if you take the gematria of that pasuk, Paru, vayishretzu, etc., the gematria of that pasuk is tikkun lenishmat ha'adam. It was a tikkun for the neshama of Adam and Chava. Let's go through the items one by one. Paru. We spoke about that part of the chet of the Etz Hadat resulted from the negligence of Adam HaRishon in performing the mitzvah of Pru Uruvu. Paru, tikun le'ikuv ha'adam b'mitzvat Pru Uruvu. Vayishretzu, sheretz is synonymous with a nachash, tikun lezohamat sheretz, a nachash. Vayirbu, we said that when Chava was seduced by the nachash, she added something that she shouldn't have added. The Nachash said to her, you're not allowed to eat from the Etz Hadat. But Chava said, and Hashem also told us not to touch the Etz Hadat, which Hashem didn't tell them not to touch. She was over bebal tosef. She added something which is not allowed, so she came to sin from the Etz Hadat as a result of that. So Vayirbu is tikun lebal tosef, lo leharbot. Vaya'atzmu, Vaya'atzmu is from the shoresh of etz, Vaya'atzmu, tikun le'etz hadat. Bime'od, tikun lechava, bime'od begematria is ha'ima, talking about chava. Me'od, why does it say bime'od me'od? Every word has a specific meaning. Tikun la'adam she'achal min ha'etz, me'od begematria adam. ותמלא הארץ אותם תיקון למוות שנגזר עליהם. As a result of the Etz Hadat, they became mortal, and they had the din of mavet. Before that, they were immortal, they would be living forever. As a result of the Chet Etz Hadat, they became mortal, din mavet. So, in order to letaken, ותמלא הארץ אותם, with life, to letaken at the gzar din mavet in Gan Eden. Everybody knows the pasuk from Shir HaShirim. It says, Tachat hatapuach orarticha, shama chiblatcha imecha, shama chibla yeladatcha. It's from Shir HaShirim. We read it on Pesach. We're going to be reading it very soon, in about 2 months' time. Everyone knows the story. What most of the Mefarshim explain this pasuk to mean. They say that when the slaves, Am Yisrael were slaves in Egypt, their wives used to seduce their husbands in order to mekayem pru urevu. They put on makeup and they dressed very nicely, and they seduced them under the tree. Even after a hard, back-breaking day's work of slave labor, they united with their wives. V'lachen paru vayishretzu vayirbu. So it says, Tachat tapuach orarticha. Shlomo HaMelech in Shir HaShirim is referring to the woman in Egypt, enabling Am Yisrael to multiply prodigiously. But in Sefer Meir Panim, I bring a completely different interpretation of the pasuk Tachat tapuach orarticha. The question is it says that they seduced them under the apple tree, Tachat tapuach orarticha, right? The question is where you find apple trees in Egypt. There are no apple trees in Egypt, and the simple reason why there are no apple trees in Egypt is because the climate is not conducive to growing apples. To grow apples, you need a cold climate, not an equatorial climate. There was no apple trees in Egypt. Okay? You don't find any apple trees in Egypt. Ela kavanat hakatuv shama chiblatcha imecha, where it says that Shama chiblatcha imecha, it's talking about Chava shehitpicha lechem chametz mipri etz hadat. Tachat tapuach is referring to lechem tafuach, lechem which is risen up, which has become chametz. That's what it means. Tachat tafuach, talking about the sin of Chava with etz hadat. There's a gematria belechem haklokel there. וכך קלקלה את חלתו של העולם. שמה חיבלה ילדתך, שעל ידי זה נגזר עליה בעצב תלדי בנים. שמה חיבלה ילדתך, the birth process became very difficult. It says בעצב תלדי בנים, there was מידה כנגד מידה, we spoke about that last week. ותחת התפוח אומר הקדוש ברוך הוא, עוררתיך. I woke you up. בידי נשים צדקניות במצרים. This is the reference of Shlomo HaMelech, referring to the women in Egypt who helped the nation prodigiously multiply. לתקן חטא חווה והתרשלות אדם במצוות פרו ורבו, ושלח גואל לגאלנו. In the pasuk it says, Shama chiblatcha, chibla yeladatcha. If you take the word Shama and you change the order of the letters around, you get the word Moshe. Moshe tachat Shama. Orarticha in Gematria is Chishevet HaKetz, which Hashem changed the calculation of the Geula, and it's also the Gematria of Orosh and Mashiach. So the whole process of Am Yisrael being slaves in Egypt was a tikkun for Chet Etz Hadat. התיקון לזוהמת הנחש הוא בגאולת מצרים וכן בגאולה לעתיד לבוא בחודש ניסן. We said that there's a machloket in the Gemara when the Briat HaOlam took place, was it in Nisan or whether it was in Tishrei. One of the opinions says it was in Nisan, and therefore the tikkun has to take place in Nisan in the time of Pesach. Skipping forward to source number 20. בעשר המכות העניש הקדוש ברוך הוא, הבורא יתברך, מידה כנגד מידה את פרעה. Another nickname for Paro in sefer Yechezkel, Yechezkel calls Paro Hatanim Hagadol, the big crocodile or the big serpent, referring to the Nachash, because Paro was a Gilgul of the Nachash. So in order to punish the Nachash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished his Gilgul, who was Paro, with Eser Makot. If you take the gematria of the word Seor, which is Chametz, in gematria it is Detzach Adash Be'achav, referring to the Eser Makot. So let's go through the Makot one by one to see how it was Midah keneged Midah. Dam keneged kilelat ha'isha bedam nida ubetulin. Before Chava sinned with the Etz Hadat, it was like a Polaroid process. You wanted to have a child, snap, 2 seconds later out came the baby, fully grown, no labor pains, no epidural, no nothing. But after the sin of Chava, it became Be'etzef Tel Dibanim, including Dam Nida Dam Betulin. Tzvardea, if you take the letters of the word Tzvardea, it makes the word Tziref De'a. In other words, by causing Chava to eat from the Etz Hadat, the Nachash attached Da'at to Chava, which Hashem forbade them to eat from the Etz Hadat. Shetziref hanachash lechava de'a be'ochla min ha'etz. And in the Makkah of the Tzvardea, one of the things the Tzvardea that the Pasuk specifically mentions is that they jumped into the Mitzrim's beds, and it adds there, uvetanurecha uvemish'arotecha. Why specifically did the frogs jump into the oven where they were baking the bread? Ma kesher. Because it's a tikkun for Chava baking a bread. כנגד לחם החמץ שאפתה חווה בעצת הנחש. קינים מהעפר על של קלקל הנחש את שערותיה של חווה. There's a Gemara in Masechet Brachot that says when Chava was first presented to Adam Harishon, it was a kind of a chatuna. It was like a kind of a chatuna, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was the Shoshvin, he was the Shoshvin who led Chava down the aisle, so to speak. And as a present to Adam for the wedding, he braided Chava's hair. That's what it says in the Gemara. That's the first time it talks about braiding. And Derech Hagav, that is one of the origins of the minhag, to have challah, which is braided in the shape of a braided loaf. Shekala HaKadosh Baruch Hu leChava, but when Chava sinned, what is the result of that? V'nistama ba'ene ba'ala. In other words, her hair became, instead of braided is also a siman of tzniut. Instead of having your hair flowing in all directions, by braiding it is a more kind of tsanua configuration. But after the sin, the hair became unbraided, and she became defiled in the eyes of her husband. So the kinim, which affected the Mitzrim's hair, was a midah keneged midah against that aspect of the chet etz hadat. Arov, which was the the wild animals, מפני שהוריד את האדם לדרגת בהמות. Because before that, Adam Arishon was an enormous stature. Once he'd eaten from the Etz Hadat, he became mortal. He acquired physical attributes, כמו בהמה. It says in Kohelet, ומותר האדם מן הבהמה עין. If you check the DNA of a human cell compared to an animal cell, the DNA is about 99% the same between an animal, a gorilla and a human being. 99 out of 100% of the DNA is exactly the same. There's only one tiny percent which differentiates human DNA from animal DNA. And that is the purpose of the human is to raise themselves above the level of the animal. Dever, shehevi mita la'olam. By eating from the Etz Hadat, they became mortal. It brought death to the world. וכילה הקדוש ברוך הוא ברחמיו הרבים תחילה את המקנה והבהמה במצרים ולא את הנפש. So by all rights, in order to atone for the sin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have destroyed all the Egyptians by killing them. But out of Rachamim, he didn't do that. He only killed their livestock and not themselves. Afterwards, at the end, it was the Bechorot as well, but beginning with the Dever as a warning. Shchin, the son of Shchin, מפני שקלקל אורם של אדם ואשתו, כי דכתיב כותנות אור וילבישם. Before the sin of the Chet Etz Hadat, Adam and Chava had special covering on their skin. The nails that we have on our fingers and on our toes, that is the same kind of skin covering that Adam and Chava had all over their entire body before the Chet. It was called kotnot or with an aleph. And it was a kind of a protective covering, and it was also very highly spiritual. It's a whole Kabbalistic discussion, which I'm not going to get into, the meaning of the fingernails and the tumah and the tahara, but that was a very elevated skin covering, which was destroyed by the sin of the Etz Hadat, and therefore, Shchin was a midah keneged midah against the skin of the Egyptians to punish them for that. Ve'esh mitlakachat betoch habarad. The next one was the hail, the barad. What was interesting about the barad is that inside the barad there was fire. There was ice, and inside the ice there was fire. Combination of fire and water, which is completely contrary to natural laws. It doesn't exist in nature. It was something supernatural. And where else do we find something, a combination of fire and water? We find that when Adam Arishon was expelled from Gan Eden, it says that Hashem put two angels at the entrance to Gan Eden, and in their hands there was a lahat hacherev hamitapechet. What does it mean, lahat hacherev hamitapechet? And in Da'at Skeni Mibalat Tosfot, he says that shemitapechet michamin letzonen umitzonen lechamin. It's a description of Gehinom. Gehinom, everybody in their minds thinks of Gehinom as a very hot place, right? Think heat and fire. But actually Gehinom is both. It's fire and ice. It mitapech kol hazman, from hot to cold to hot to cold. And that is the description of Gehinom according to the Da'at Skeni Mibalat Tosfot. That's what it means, lahat hacherev hamitapechet. So here again we have a connection between barad, which was the fire and ice, atoning for the result of the Chet Etz Hadat, which was the lahat hacherev hamitapechet. In the pasuk it says, "V'achita v'akusemet lo nuku, katzru am Yisrael chita terem shachalua harbe, avur sodet lechem hapanim b'midbar." Okay, that's not really relevant to what we want to talk about. Okay, sorry, let's just skip forward. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. The next makah after barad was arbe. Why was arbe midah keneged midah? Because in the klala of Chava, if you go down 5 lines from the bottom, the klala of Chava after the Chet Etz Hadat is harbe arbe itzfonech veheronech. It's a tikkun for it's a midah keneged midah against the Egyptians for causing Chava to have pain in childbirth. וכנגד קוץ ודרדר תצמיע לך. The sin of the klala of Adam Arishon was that he would have a hard time making his own food. He would sow crops, and all that would result from that would be thorns and thistles. It would be very difficult. So the arbe came and they destroyed all the crops, which was a midah keneged midah for that aspect of the klala. Choshech, why was the makkah of choshech? מפני שגורש האדם למקום שנקרא ארץ. According to the Zohar HaKadosh, when Adam was expelled from Gan Eden, he was sent to a different part of the world. There's everyone knows the concept of Shiva Reki'im, that there are 7 levels in heaven. So according to the Kabbalistic sources, just like there are 7 levels in heaven, there are also 7 levels in earth. There's a layer upon layer upon layer as you go further in, and one of those layers is called choshech. It's called eretz, and zeh makom chashuch. It's not the same level of spiritual light as existed in Gan Eden. Bechorot, the last of the 10 makot, al sheharag bechora shel Chava, it's midah keneged midah of Chava's bechor, who was Cain, killing Hevel, שנולד מזוהמת הנחש את בכורו של אדם שהוא הבל. So that was מידה כנגד מידה. הקדוש ברוך הוא killed the בכורות מצרים, and it says גם בכור השפחה אשר אחר הרחיים. It specifies in the pasuk which בכורות, even the בכור of the slave who was working with a millstone grinding flour. מה הקשר? Why didn't you say also the slave who was cleaning the bathroom? Mazek kashur to grinding flour, right? So again, it's a reference to Chava, who ground the flour and made a chametz bread. Source number 21.
You were going to mention that even the word chametz is an extension of the name Cham, because you mentioned that Egypt came from Cham.
I wasn't going to mention it, but it's very interesting.
When you first said from Cham, I was sure you were going to go straight into that.
Very, very interesting idea. Source number 21. בפסח נצטוו באכילת מצות לתקן זוהמת הנחש, כי מצות תאכלו בגמטריה is ויאמר הנחש אל האישה לא. So the sin of Chava was making a chametz bread. So in order to metaken that, you have to make the opposite of a chametz bread. The opposite of a chametz bread is bread that is flat, that doesn't rise up. Source number 22. בצאת ישראל ממצרים נאסרו באכילת חמץ לתקן חטא עץ הדת שהיה לחם חמץ, שכן אוכל מחמצת בגמטריה is תיקון חטא האדם. מהו חמץ? Okay, so here we start getting into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the definition of what exactly is chametz, okay? This is not a spiritual explanation, it's a chemical definition. It's the halachic definition of chametz. Ma'u chametz, machmetzet, ve'seor. Chametz, machmetzet, and seor all refer to the same thing. There are different synonyms for the same concept. Chametz, machmetzet, and seor are just different words for the same thing. The definition of chametz according to the halacha is garinim or kemach mimine dagan. If you take grains or flour ground from the grains, from the 5 species of the grains which we said are wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye, those are chamesh mine dagan. Either the grains themselves or the flour made from those grains, if they are mixed with water and they are left without any activity for a period of at least 18 minutes by halacha, that is defined as chametz. That is the halachic definition of chametz.
So Sahakol is flour and water.
Flour and water, basically, for 18 minutes or more.
18 minutes or more.
18 minutes or more.
Does the word sour bread come from Saor?
It comes from dafka, from machmetzet, which is chamutz.
Sour and Saor sound very similar.
I don't know. You need to talk to a linguist to see if the English was derived. I'm not sure.
Maybe the minhag of my mother's family back home, they used to not eat gavoch. Talking Pesach gavoch, children, and growing up, they had a cup of coffee, and they took the matzah and
Dipped it in the
dipped
coffee.
it inside, crumble it and put it in the coffee, and they had to finish quick before 18 minutes and wash the cup of the.
Okay.
So, no, and that's how we grew up, and we were always amazed. You're not, when we have soup, and you're not allowed to crumble inside.
So your family didn't eat kneidlach.
Nachon, and all these things are all baking with matzah meal. Also, we're not allowed only potato starch. So, but this, quick with the coffee and the thing. It was like we were always like amazed. How is that allowed? That's allowed. No question asked.
So we're going to.
Here is from here, maybe.
So we're going to examine the concept of why 18 minutes. We're going to examine that more in detail in the fourth shiur, where I talk about the chemistry of chametz, what actually happens when bread ferments. We're going to be talking about that a little bit more. But gebrochts, you should just know, is a chumrah. Gebrochts in Yiddish means broken up. That's the translation of the word gebrochts. It means matzah that is broken up. And the reason that some people have the minhag not to eat matzah that is broken up or ground into matzah flour and mixed with liquid is because they have a chashash that the inside of the matzah may not have been fully baked, that there may still be some raw flour in the interior part of the matzah, that if that comes into contact with water for 18 minutes or more, it becomes chametz. But that's just a chumrah. Most of the time the matzah is pretty well baked through, especially but that is so very thin. The Teimanim maybe have more of a inyan because their matzah is much thicker. But the Ashkenazim is very... אבל בכל מקרה, מנהג ישראל is כמו halacha. Everyone should follow the minhag. Okay, so we said last week that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in 6 days, he got to the 6th day, and what did it say? Vayare Elokim et kol asher asa, v'hine tov me'od. What did Hashem create during the 6 days? He created the heaven and earth, the light, etc. And one of the things that he created was the Yetzer Hara, which was also one of the things that created in the 6 days. And Hashem on the 6th day considered everything that he created Tov Me'od, including the Yetzer Hara, including the Nachash. So what does it mean that it was good, okay? Source number 23, 3 lines down. Hanachash nimtza began Eden, v'habore chishvo letov me'od. Hashem considered it a good thing. It was part of the whole of creation. Kamochen, the same thing we find inside a bread which you make with flour and water. בתוך המים, על קליפות הגרעינים, ובתוך הקמח לאחר שנטחן, נמצאים יצורים חיים בלתי נראים לעין. On the skins of the grains, and when you grind up the grains into flour, you find it in the flour as well. You find microorganisms which are natural yeasts and bacteria that live on the wheat as they are growing in the field. They are invisible, you cannot see them except for under the microscope. שמרים טבעיים בחיידקים, מייצרי חומצות. כל עוד יצורים אלה נמצאים במים לבד, או על קליפות הגרעין לבד, או בקמח לבד, הם אינם פעילים כלל. As long as you just have the flour on its own or the grains on its own, not coming into contact with water, the microorganisms are inactive. They don't do anything. רק לאחר שערבבו את הגרעינים או הקמח עם המים, והשהנו, עיכבנו את התערובת זו ל-18 דקות או יותר, השמרים והחיידקים נעשים פעילים ומשתלטים על הבצק, והתוצאה היא חמץ. If you make a break in the process of preparing the dough, in other words, you knead the dough, and then you leave it to rest for 18 minutes or more without continually kneading the dough, without activity, the yeast takes over in the dough and it starts producing air and it starts fermenting in the dough. Lama rak mimine dagan. Why only flour from the 5 species? If you make bread with quinoa flour or rice flour, by definition that cannot be chametz because it's not one of the chameshet minei dagan. So why only from the 5 species? Ki elu hem perot etz hadat. Those are the fruits that were on the etz hadat: chita, seora, kusmin, shipon, v'shibolet shual. ולמה רק במים ולא במי פירות? If you take wheat flour or spelt flour, and instead of mixing with water, you mix it with apple juice, and you even add yeast to it, and you leave it for 2 hours, by definition that is not chametz. By halachic definition, it's called me perot, and it means it's not chametz. In other words, the definition of chametz has to include water. It has to be water and not me perot. And why? Even though that the chemical reactions are very similar, the one is considered chimutz, and the other one is called sirachon. In the Gemara, we'll talk about that in the 4th shiur. אבל למה במים ולא במי פירות? The reason is, כי it says in פרשת בראשית, ועד יעלה מן הארץ וישקע את כל פני האדמה. וייצר השם את האדם. הנחש פיתה את חווה לעשות לחם, כפי שברא הקדוש ברוך הוא את האדם, באפר ובמים. Hashem created Adam Arishon by mixing sand, and the sand was moistened with water, not with fruit juice, but with water. So the tikkun for that of making lechem chametz was with water and not with fruit juice. חז"ל דימו את החמץ ליצר הרע, כי דרכי פעולתם שוות. The activity of the yetzer hara, the modus operandi of the yetzer hara and chametz are very similar. חמץ הוא תוצאה של השתלטות השמרים והחיידקים בבצק לאחר השהיה או עיכוב ללא פעילות כלל. The way chametz comes about is by letting the dough rest without any activity for a certain period of time, and that is how chametz is created. כאשר הבצק נהיה רפוי, I don't know if anybody's made bread or kneaded dough, but the more you knead the dough, the tighter the dough becomes. It tightens itself up, it becomes more elastic. When you leave the dough to rest after a half an hour, it sort of becomes more lax. It becomes more supple and less tight. כמו כן, במקום של ריפיון, עיכוב וחוסר פעילות המייצרים ריקנות, we spoke about this last week, in a place of rifayon where you are not diligent in performing HaKadosh Baruch Hu's mitzvot, you delay, you want to take a vacation from the Yahadut and the Torah, you create an empty space, you create a vacuum, hayetzer hara steps into this vacuum, v'ne'eseh pa'il, it becomes active, mishtalet v'nehefach lera. That's when the yetzer becomes the yetzer hara. When you allow the yetzer to take over and mishtalet, that is when it's called the yetzer hara. Skip a line there. לעומת זאת, however, אם לא מעכבים ומשאים את הבצק אפילו לרגע, אלא מקפידים לרדות בו בלישה ובעבודה מתמדת. However, if you don't let the dough rest, but you are constantly working with the dough, you're kneading it and shaping it and doing things with it, you're not just letting it set aside to have a vacation, אפילו שהקמח והמים מעורבבים, ואפילו שבצק נמצאים שמרים וחיידקים, הבצק לא נשאר רפוי, אלא מתחזק, אינו נהפך לחמץ, ונמצא שאנחנו שולטים בבצק, ואילו השמרים והחיידקים אינם שולטים בו. There's a halacha that as long as you're kneading the dough, even if you knead the dough for an hour after the flour and the water have been mixed, by halachic definition, the batzek is not chametz. The stopwatch, the timer of counting the 18 minutes is from the minute you finish kneading the dough. That is when you stop the activity, that is when the timer begins. Today they are much more machmir. Today they begin the timer from the time the water is added to the dough. That's a chumrah, but the halachic definition is from the time that the kneading ends. כל זמן שאנחנו רודים ביצר, as long as we are in control of the יצר הרע, ולא נותנים לו לרדות בנו, הוא אינו נהפך ליצר הרע. As long as we control our own יצר הרע and don't allow the יצר הרע to control us, it doesn't take over and control us. ושמרתם את המצות, okay. שימור ורדייה בבצק וכן רדייה ביצר הרע, על ידי שמחה וחיוך מעלה את האדם לאספקלריה המהירה ולקשר פנים עם בוראו. Okay, that's connected to the lechem hapanim. We'll skip that. המצה עשויה מבצק של קמח מיני דגן ומים. Matzah, what is the difference between regular bread and matzah? They're both made with flour and water. אבל the difference is that there's no delay. ללא עיכוב, השהיה וריפיון. The bread, the dough doesn't have a chance to sit and become lax. It is constantly being worked on. מרגע שמוסיפים את המים לקמח, לא עוברים 18 דקות ללא פעילות כלשהי. It's a continuous process of activity. Lisha, the two different rooms, one with the flour, one with the water. The mashgiach says, L'shem matzot mitzvah. The two come together, they pour the flour and the water together, and that begins the timer. You then knead the dough, lisha. After the lisha, which is a very difficult thing before they had modern electronic mixers, they used to do it all by hand. Matzah dough is a very stiff dough. They still do when they make hand matzahs. They use a special table with a metal bar connected to the table by a hinge, like a kind of a guillotine, which they continually bring down on the very stiff dough to flatten it down. Otherwise, very difficult to knead it. After you've kneaded it, then you have the gilgul. Then you need to break it into pieces and roll it out. You need to flatten it. You need to make the shape. You have to make holes in it. You have to bake it. It's constant activity. There's not a second where the dough is left to its own devices and rest. שמרים וחיידקים נמצאים בקמח ובמים, אבל לא פותחים להם פתח של עיכוב להשתלט על הבצק. They don't have a second to get a foothold in the dough and become חמץ. לפיכך, הבצק שנשאו בני ישראל בצאתם ממצרים לסוכות, שמה אפוהו למצות לא החמיץ. כי היה צרורות בסמלותם על שכמם. When Am Yisrael left Mitzrayim, they didn't bake the matzot before they left. They took the dough with them. If you check what the pasuk says, et betsekam terem yachmatz. Lakhu et betsekam, they took the dough. They didn't take the matzahs ready baked. They took the unbaked dough with them. And according to the Mefarshim, they only baked this dough when they reached Sukkot, which was about 2 days' journey away from Ramses. So you have dough sitting around for 2 days. How is it possible that in 2 days this dough did not become chametz? And the answer is because it says in the pasuk, "Tzirurot besimlotam al shichmam." They tied the dough to their belts and they were walking on their shoulders, and the walking and the constant jostling of this dough was like it was constant kneading of the dough. It was considered activity, wasn't considered that it allowed the dough to rest. לישה מעכבת חימוץ ולישת הבצק היא תרופה למחמצת, and the gematria of מחמצת is lishat batzek. That is the trufa for chametz. Okay, source number 24, the final source. במצרים ואף ביציאת מצרים עדיין שלט בבני ישראל היצר. When Am Yisrael went out of Egypt, they were at mem tet sha'arei tuma. It says HaKadosh Baruch Hu chishev et haketz. What does that mean? That if Hashem would have redeemed them 1 second later, then Am Yisrael would have been over the brink. They would have been beyond redemption. They were so low in the level of spirituality that they would have been unredeemable. Hashem took them out at exactly the moment before they went over the threshold. They were at the lowest stage that they could be, and therefore they were very vulnerable. And in order to metaken, instead of allowing them to eat chametz, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to eat matzot, which has no yetzer hara. Am Yisrael were very vulnerable. Any activity of the yetzer hara could have destroyed Am Yisrael. So we want to get rid of the yetzer hara. You want to get rid of the bread that symbolizes the yetzer hara, and that is why the bread of Yetziat Mitzrayim is matzot and not allowed to be chametz. לכן בפסח נצטוו על קורבן העומר. Also on Chag HaPesach, we bring a korban ha'omer. Why dafka on Chag HaPesach? Haba mehaseorim. Korban ha'omer comes from barley. Barley is considered animal food. It's not usually eaten by humans. It's more considered food for feeding the cows and the sheep. It's considered an animalistic kind of food, symbolizing the level of Am Yisrael when they went out of Egypt. וכן אסר הבורא אכילת חמץ בו יצר הרע רודה באדם, וציווה לאכול מצות זין ימים כנגד זין ימי בראשית מחודשים. The whole תהליך of יציאת מצרים, it's another shiur completely, was a a rehash of Briyat HaOlam. Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Eser Makot, it was all a replay of Briyat HaOlam. The Mefarshim go into each of the different Makot and explain how one was the next, compared to the first day of creation, the light, and the separating the water, etc. It's a replay of creation. Lechem Oni hu lechem she'en hayetzer mistater bo. The word lechem oni in gematria is nir'eh, which means it is visible. What does it mean, lechem oni? Everyone thinks lechem oni means a poor man's bread, right? From ani. But the true meaning of lechem oni means that it's transparent. There's nothing in a matzah that is not visible. There's no hidden things in the matzah. It's just plain flour and water. And according to some minhagim, they add salt. The Temanim add salt to the matzah. The Ashkenazim don't add salt. But it's nothing hidden in the matzah, as opposed to a chametz bread, where you have something inside the bread which is not visible, which is the chametz. That's why it's called lechem oni, because it's the gematria of oni is nir'eh. It's completely visible, and that's what Hashem wanted us to eat when we went out of Egypt. Be'ezrat Hashem, in the next shiur, we're going to be talking about the final stage of the tikkun for the Chet Etzadat, which was Matan Torah. And in the same shiur, we're also going to be discussing chametz in the Beit HaMikdash, all the different manachot which had chametz, which didn't have chametz, and why.